Good evening and welcome to ReachLawyer Sóz. ReachLawyer Sóz is a program of ReachLawyer to discuss, debate, support issues and challenges faced by women at home, at workplace, and in the society. Untangled, Setting Her Free is a series of talks on the issues around domestic violence. Today's topic, to soothe a jarring note. Welcome to ReachLawyer Sóz. I would now like to hand over the session to our moderator, Ms. Tusharika Veg. Tusharika, over to you.
Thank you, Nitin. So welcome everyone to the day 6 of the Untangled Setting Her Free series. We've had 5 successful sessions so far, and all of them have helped us to understand the challenges of domestic violence better from different angles. So one of our aims behind launching this 8-day-long talk show program was to lend an ear to hear to all those muffled voices who usually, do not get an outlet. This program was an endeavor to enable the survivors of domestic violence to reach out to us. To our live audience hearing us, if you or anyone you know is suffering in silence and needs legal assistance, please write to us on askreachlawyer@gmail.com. The email is right on my screen, and our team will immediately get back to you and hopefully help you. So the topic for today's discussion is to soothe a jarring note. The intersection between domestic violence and workplace is often less discussed. Domestic violence hurts productivity. It's a jarring note. A woman in abusive relationship might not share her difficulties out openly in public, but it does affect her work. It affects her comfort at the workplace. There's a need for creating an enabling environment to help all those who are suffering in silence in abusive relationships. Growing number of industries also find it necessary to do the same. More needs to be done in this regard, says Madhumita Venkatraman, to soothe a jarring note. Madhumita ma'am is the founder of Diversity Dialogues and a trained counselor, in one of the authors of a guide which talks about workplaces and domestic violence. Diversity Dialogues is a collective which works with corporates, NGOs, and social enterprises in making the ecosystem more diverse and inclusive from a strategy, culture, talent, policies, practices, and infrastructure perspective. They also publish a range of accessible and freely available resources on less spoken about aspects of diversity and inclusion. Madhumita ma'am has deep experiences in working with multiple diversity groups, including groups on domestic violence, and has held diversity and inclusion in large organizations and startup environments like Hindustan Coca-Cola Beverages, JE, Merson, and Snapdeal. Ma'am is certified in gender and sexuality, sign language, and now a trained mental health professional. She is recognized on platforms like Women Economic Forum, World HRD Congress, Orenam for her work in this space. She is passionate about making inclusion a way of life. So, without any further ado, I now call upon the woman herself, Madhumita ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tusharika, and very, very happy to be here. And thank you for giving me this platform to talk about, like you rightly said, a subject I think is very little spoken about. I want to start with a small story. Years back when I started my career, this is almost about 13 years back, then, 13, 14 years back when I started my career in one of the organizations that I worked with. There was a colleague of mine, and both of us were working together. I was in the HR space, so was she. And at some point in time, she decided to go on decided to take some time off for marriage. And then she came back to work. Okay. And post that, in about the next 6 months time frame, see, she suddenly lost a lot of weight, started looking really, really tired, had a lot of bruises in her arms, and she would come to work every single day. Right. And somehow, though I was sitting right next to her, it isn't like I was far away. It isn't like I was sitting somewhere else. I was sitting right next to her. Other than saying what happened, how come there is a bruise here? And she would respond back saying, I was cutting vegetables and I got a bruise, or I was having a small issue and I got a bruise. There was nothing else. Her performance was also dipping during this time frame. And there were lots of, and it was a sudden change. I mean, not something, before that was there. There was a sudden change and a sudden dip in performance. And as being somebody who was very early in my career, I somehow felt, oh my God, I am having to do her work also. And I was feeling like, what is happening and how is the organization not taking a note of this, and so on and so forth. Eventually, a few months later, she left the organization. And at that point in time, the news or the information that came to us was that she was going through domestic violence, had decided to take a divorce, and had decided to move cities. Right. The reason I bring this episode, this particular instance back, is it is only in the last few years that I have realized that I could have been of greater support to her. Sitting right next to her telling me this also, I just didn't realize that there's something different that I needed to do in the situation. Right. And this is what makes this whole conversation very, very pertinent, very, very real for all of us, because we don't even know what's going on. And we're all working together and we're all sort of moving forward without knowing that an individual next to us may be actually experiencing this. And do we give people a space safe enough for them in the first place to be able to even talk about it? So this entire piece, and this is something that has stayed with me, is what led for us at Diversity Dialogues to publish a guide on what can workplaces also do. In addition, the pandemic, and therefore the shadow pandemic is actually domestic violence, because the number of cases of domestic violence, as per multiple researches, as per multiple bodies of work, has significantly gone up. For example, if I were to quote, literally 243 million women and girls between the age of 15 and 49 are at the receiving end of domestic violence during the first year of the pandemic, which was around 2020. And this is a published report by UN Women, right, across the globe. The number of calls have gone up significantly. And almost doubled and tripled on the National Children's Women Helpline. So there are so many things. So when, as an employer, we have meetings online and we tell each other, stay safe and stay at home, is that really the condition for all of us, right? So that by itself needs to be realized that not all of us sitting at home are feeling safe. And I want to point out and say that while we're talking about it in the context of women, it's very much a reality in the context of persons with disability, in the context of members of the LGBTQIA plus community, so many other communities, that because essentially domestic violence is, and any form of violence is, a power control struggle. It's essentially that. And all these groups, if there are representatives of that in the organization, may or may not be going through this. So therefore, it's important to note. I also want to qualify here that when we talk about domestic violence, we're not really only talking about verbal abuse. We're also talking about emotional abuse. We're talking about isolation. When somebody is isolated completely, we only also are talking about intimidation, stalking, sexual abuse, which, of course, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act in the country for workplaces also covers, and many organizations have strict policies around financial control, spiritual abuse. So there are many different types of abuse as well. We're not only talking about physical violence. So therefore, that needs to be taken into account. Very often, a few different thoughts, a few different things that come up, right, is one, especially in the workplace context, is one, this whole thought process of, it's a personal matter. It's not something that I have to worry about as a manager, as a team member, as an employee. I don't have to worry about it. It's the personal matter of the individual. I agree. The decision to stay in a relationship like that is definitely and most certainly a decision that the individual needs to make. And they need to be owning their life and deciding for it. So in that sense, sure, it is a personal matter. Having said that, it's also an environmental thing. It's also the larger ecosystem. It's also the larger societal bit that plays a role. And therefore, workplaces have a context to play. There is a loss of productivity. There is a loss of output. There is absenteeism, presentism, all of these things, like I spoke about in the first example, that is very much, an outcome of domestic violence. And therefore, it does impact. It does very, very much impact workplaces, right? If I were to quote, for example, there was a KPMG study which was done in partnership with Vodafone, and this was done years back. And according to this study, literally about 2 to 9.7 billion is sort of the result of the cumulative effect of the absenteeism, of domestic violence, of the adjoining presentism that ends up happening, right? And you literally have about 4.5 million women missing out on a promotion, about $12.9 billion lost in potential earnings. And I'm only quoting some of the different responses or some of the different studies that are very much there. And if one were to look at productivity, if the productivity of domestic violence survivors is 1% lower, the value of the lost economic input would be about $0.9 billion per year. And this entire statistic and study is at a time when the pandemic wasn't even present. So right now, with the great resignation in play, with the burnout in play, with what women are experiencing, and the cases of domestic violence going up, these numbers are likely to be much, much higher. So that is something that needs to be kept in mind, right? And out when we look at this data on one hand, and we look at how many workplaces have policies around it, have conversations around it, it is very, very little. So according to an SHRM study, majority of the organizations, about 70%, 80% don't have any kind of policy around this entire piece. Though 16% of the same organizations have had instances of domestic violence in the organization, walking into the organization in the year. Right. So there are a lot of different studies that tell us that it is problematic. It is something that we certainly need to look at. And if you look at the larger ramification of this is also, I mean, what if the violence perpetrates itself into the organization? Well, what if the stalking happens in the organization, for example? So it isn't always indirect. What if it happens online? It's also very often related to workplace aggression. And having perpetrators in the organization, for example, could not just be difficult at home, but could be happening in the office also. So there are many different scenarios, therefore, that make this a very relevant and a very important conversation to have. So what do we do about this? That's sort of the next thing to speak about. What are some of the things that the organization can do? How can organizations sort of contribute to this? What can really happen? The first and the foremost thing that organization needs to do around this is to break the taboo, which means that, today it's an unspoken conversation. And many of our work with organizations at this point in time has been to educate the leadership, to educate the managers, to educate the employee, and to make it all right to be able to even talk about it. Because again, research sort of indicates that out of all the different people, all these big numbers, only 1 in 10, for example, are comfortable even sharing this with their manager. The rest don't even want to. So breaking taboos would involve breaking myths like, for example, it is only a personal matter. Like, for example, that it is an expression of love and it therefore happens in every relationship. And therefore, it's about improving the relationship and getting back into the whole thing. Like, very often we tend to believe the other side of it, telling a woman or telling a survivor, why don't you just leave the relationship? Why she's still going through this violence. So many of these kind of myths, many of these kind of beliefs that we have, that breaking of taboos is the first piece. The second piece is to publish information. So one of the organizations that we were working with, the recommendation was every time you have a presentation, you start the presentation, whether it is on domestic violence or not, with helplines and with details, not just with respect to mental health, but also with respect to domestic violence. So that people are sort of saying, okay, now if I am somebody who's going through this, I know the organization's recognizing it because at least they're putting it out there. The third important factor is many organizations today have counseling networks and support for employees. Are these counselors, are these networks, for example, enabled to provide support to a domestic violence survivor? And do they have the wherewithal to check for that? The fourth part, which is equally sort of important, is to ensure that there is some level of a policy, a reasonable accommodation policy, if you will, which talks about what is the organization support. For example, can there be leave given to such employees? Can there be a relocation policy in place? Can there be performance protection for that point in time, compensation protection for that point in time when a person is going through this? So because like in the story that I shared and my understanding of the space, my working in the space with survivors, that period is very, very difficult. And therefore, at that time, to concentrate to fully on work and things like that becomes extremely difficult. To train people, in addition to breaking taboo, on being supporters, on how do you give first response, on how if tomorrow I am a manager, an employee walks up to me and says, I am going through domestic violence, what can I tell them? How can I speak to them? What are the no's? What are things I should not be saying? What are things I can be saying? How can I listen? Where do I realize it isn't my there is a boundary here and this needs to be then given off to somebody else? This needs to be something I need to engage a counselor into or a lawyer into. How do I sort of make this that demarcation? Because very often managers, leaders, people are wanting to support. But very often we take on the whole responsibility of supporting. We take on the whole responsibility of leave your family and come to my house. Is that okay? Should there be something else one could do? How do you even go through this entire thing? So that piece of how do you have that conversation and provide the first level of support, that is something to be able to look at also. Right, so these are the different things. The last point is to have a very clear set of guidelines around what if the employee is a perpetrator of domestic violence in the organization. So if there is an employee who is a perpetrator, will the organization take an action against the employee? Will there be support for rehabilitation, for example? Will there be a policy around hiring of perpetrators, and we will not hire or we will not support? Those are the different things also to look at, because finally you are looking to establish a safe workspace. Other forms of support can be also leveraging other employee care network. If you have medical services, emergency services, you have employee unions, other forms of bodies who can support the employee through this entire transition and difficulty, and even just to understand. Having very strong whistleblower expectations, for example, becomes important, because for example, if I know about somebody else experiencing domestic violence and I want to report it, do I have protection in terms of confidentiality? Do I have, will there be some kind of retaliation, and how will the organization protect me against that? Those become kind of very important things to do. The last part of it is to understand personal and professional boundaries, and that is important, because finally many a times often individuals who are supporting through this will just say leave the relationship and walk out. But there is a relationship in place, there are repercussions of that relationship. Is there financial freedom? Is there, if there is a child in the picture, it's a different kind of complication. So finally it's a decision that the survivor makes, and to be able to respect that and say that the decision is that of the survivor and I'm going to walk behind them or with them. I think all those become very important points to think about. So that's sort of the different aspects, the different things that workplaces can do. The simplest thing to do, though, is to believe that you need to do something as a workplace, as an organization, that this is important, that this is as important. Today, diversity, equity, inclusion is a dialogue, is a conversation, is something many organizations are focusing on tremendously, to understand that this is a part of it. Right, and this is can't be a way, because many communities who are minority groups are also experiencing this, and so you can't completely move your eyes off this and say this none of my business, and it's a personal matter that somebody has to take care of. So that by itself, I think, if the intent is there, then many of these things can come together. So that's a little bit about different things that one can do. Like I think Tusharika mentioned, I represent an organization called Diversity Dialogues. The guide is very much available. So it's tiny.cc/dv guide. You can find this out, and you can very much download it online. And I'd ask all of you to look through that guide very, very much. And also, if there is any way that we can support you in this endeavor, we would be more than happy to. So you could write to us on team@diversitydialogues.in. If there is any support that we can provide, we'd be more than happy, as an organization, as an individual, in any which way. Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you. Back to you, Tusharika.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for explaining the basic of today's topic in such a simple language, which I'm sure the audience will appreciate, because this is a concept, like we talked about, is not discussed much often. This intersection is not very popularly discussed in literature even. So for the live audience and for everyone who's there in the session, could you just explain the interrelation between diversity and inclusion concept, which has grown extremely popular in the past few decades in the corporate world, and domestic violence, so that we can start our discussion from a very foundational level?
Sure. So Tusharika, like I think I had sort of, started the whole dialogue with, if you look at any of the statistics, majority of the people going through domestic violence, and I would say maybe the others are not reported as much or whichever way, but a majority of the people going through domestic violence are today women. Right. And again, there are other communities. For example, during this period of time, members of the LGBTQ community, persons with disability experiencing it, Dalit individuals experiencing it. There is a lot of research out there. To some, I mean, lot of research is a wrong word. I think some research out there which also indicates that these are the groups that are going through this. And if you look at workplace diversity, equity, inclusion agendas, and what is the focus of it today, is to be able to increase representation of the same minority groups in the workplace, that the ones I am just speaking about. The same, women representation is a huge conversation, which is what, makes March 8th and sort of the spirit quite relevant. Persons with disability, the LGBTQIA community. I wish for more ethnic conversations around caste and ethnicity and so on. But some of these are the conversations that are there around diversity, equity, inclusion. How do we increase representation? How do you make policies? How do you retain people? Right? And so on. So that's a dialogue. Now, if you are not looking at this aspect, the fact that a lot of people, the fact that 1 in 6 women are going through this, if you're not looking at this, you're missing out on a talent pool, you're missing out on providing a safe environment, you're missing out on making the workplace and lives conducive for these women, for these persons with disability, for these LGBTQIA members. So how does your diversity, equity, inclusion charter even take off? Right? And this is what makes it a very, very relevant conversation, because domestic violence is a very difficult thing for anybody to go through. Right? And that time there is going to be a decrease in productivity. There is going to be a large impact on, just concentration. There is going to be a feeling of distress, a feeling of anxiety. If you're not supporting individuals in your workplace through this, then what are you essentially doing? How is your diversity, equity, inclusion charter going to go further? And I've already spoken about productivity. I've already spoken about output and many of these studies around it. Right? So all of that is going to come down. And it's basically a problem because you don't even know it's happening. Right? If you don't have a safe environment, a woman, if I am today going through this, how do I even tell you that? Right? I will not tell you. You will not know. My performance will go down. You will eventually sort of take action against me. And the whole system isn't conducive then to diversity, equity, inclusion, representation, anything. So therefore, this becomes sort of a very integral part to the whole conversation. I've realized my statistics has gone here and there. It's actually 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical or sexual violence. And sexual violence, sexual abuse at workplaces in specific is something that we do address out of the whole piece. But the rest as well is equally important. Does that clarify, Tusharika?
Definitely, ma'am. Ma'am, you also in your speech you noted an interesting observation, which is true, that when there is an issue such as domestic violence that people come across or hear about, they term it as a personal matter or a private space affair where you do not want to intervene. And considering that even organization culture itself promotes this professional boundary, that you do not usually talk to your colleagues or even your seniors, even at a very personal level, like hobbies or something very basic for that matter. So in this regard, you did talk about it, but how do you strike a balance as an employee when you want to help out a person who is probably a survivor of violence? And does this balance needs to be adopted at a very individual level as an employee, or does the organization as a whole needs to take some steps to strike this balance?
Sure. I think it's an excellent question. So, I first want to break that myth which I think organizations are getting more and more cognizant of, and I'm glad that they are, that this personal and professional boundary can exist only so much in our lives any longer. Many of us are going to get back to hybrid workplaces. So today, as I'm talking, this is a professional conversation for me. It falls into my workplace, but as you can see, I'm also sitting at home, and there is a whole lot of my room, my house that you can see in the background, right? So the blurring of boundaries has already been there for us for the last about 2.5 years, and with more organizations looking at hybrid ways of working, that boundary is getting further, is going to stay blurred. One. Secondly, if you look at a lot of what is happening around us, whether it is the great resignation or the amount of burnout that is happening, that's essentially also happening because of a recognition that the boundaries are blurring, right? And therefore, today in this conversation, I could have my mother walking in, suddenly, a little child walking in, and so on and so forth. It's possible, and that needs to be permitted, that needs to be allowed, because there's work-life integration, not work-life, distinction, which exists any longer. So I want to break that to begin with, that we believe an individual who comes into the workplace in a very complete way, bringing your whole self to work, is also bringing in your personal side, is also bringing in that peace of mind, is also bringing in all of that for one to be productive, right? So specifically answering the question that you asked, is it an organization responsibility, is it an individual's responsibility, is it a mix of both? In my own observation, in my own understanding, I think it is a mix of both. There is an organization responsibility to make sure that this is not considered to be a taboo subject, that there is a policy around it, there's a mention of it somewhere, there is an existence of support resources, there is an existence of spaces where if I'm going through it, I can log on somewhere, find out which are the helplines that are available, speak to them, having counselors who are enabled to give that support, making sure that there is a protocol and a system if the domestic violence walks into the workplace, how does the employee still stay protected? All these become an organization wide sort of a conversation to have, and educating and building awareness then, of course, in addition to all of this, is important, right? And at that level, it's about the organization. At an individual level, when you're noticing somebody, for example, having regular bruises or scars, or for example, wearing more than the required amount of makeup, right? Because often that is how these scars are hidden. So somebody is wearing too much makeup on a regular basis. And none of these are absolute indicators. So somebody doing this doesn't automatically mean they're going through domestic violence. But I'm going to talk about some of this. There's regular absenteeism or presentism. Presentism is I'm in the meeting and not engaging at all. Absenteeism is I'm not joining in. So call after call, day after day, somebody doesn't bother to join in, suddenly sort of logs off, suddenly logs back in. There's a sudden drop in performance. Right, in the example that I gave in the beginning, that was what was also an indicator. Sudden shift, sudden drop. The person's been doing well so far. What has suddenly gone off? There is every time, and I'm going to take online examples to offline as well. The person walks into office or is online. There is a feeling of fear, a certain anxiety, sudden, that whole thing during the whole conversation, being withdrawn, not speaking too much, not participating, seeking isolation, not being open and transparent. So every time, for example, I would ask this friend of mine, what is this blues about? There was a little look of hesitation, a certain anxiety, a certain, change. To observe that as somebody who's a peer supporter, a peer, a person who cares, that becomes important. And when all of these things, or majority of these signs that there's something wrong, and I think all of us have that little radar that goes off saying, this person was all right, Madhu was all right so far. In the last few months, I'm seeing some things change. What is happening? To have that conversation, to sit with the person and say, hey, listen, I'm seeing this. What's happening with you? Is everything all right? I'm here for you. I know we are here in professional capacity, but I also consider you a friend. Um, and to have that conversation. And if they open up about this particular thing, then to say that, okay, this is where the company stands on this. Thank you for telling me. I assure you, I will keep a certain, I will keep it confidential. Or if I have to inform with your permission, I will inform these individuals. This is the kind of, support you can take. How do you want to go about this? Helping them sometimes do safety planning, right? Which is to say, if there is a sudden exigency, do you have a bag ready where you have some cash, you have some documents, you have, who will you call when you are in danger? Where will you go? If there's a child involved, how can you ensure child safety? To help them even have that kind of conversation, right? That could be something that one can do. Right. And if you're a manager, if you're a leader and you are having this conversation, then to actually tell the person, look, we are here for you. This will not impact your job security. Because that is one of the reasons I may hesitate to talk about this at the workplace, that I'm worried. There are issues at home. And then I come here and I tell somebody and they're like, oh God, she's going through so much. She will not be productive for the next 6 months. Let's just, take some action and let's do something. So that fear of job security rests, right? To provide helplines, to provide support, so those kind of things, and if not anything else, to at least listen. And not make statements like, no, this is not a problem at all. Every relationship, this is a very common thing. This does happen, you must work on it. And I'm not talking about an only intimate partner, but any form of abuse. That tendency to say it's a common thing, just work on it. It's not a big deal. Not to make those kind of statements, or just say, just pick up your bag and leave. Neither to make that. So how do you hold that space? So that then becomes individual accountability, individual responsibility, where we tell ourselves, as a peer, as a colleague, as a manager, as a leader, this is my responsibility. So it's a culminate. I mean, it is both. It isn't one versus the other, and both need to collectively come together.
Definitely, ma'am. So I feel it's very like the entire topic and the discussion that's happening today, I think it's extremely relevant because from all the 5 days of discussions that we have had, one thing I think that everyone spoke about is that most of these times the survivors of domestic violence find an escape in the workplace or the outside world
Yes.
to find a place
Yes.
to engage themselves and distract themselves. So when the workplace is an attempt to be made into a conducive and healthy environment, I think that should be the way to go. However, one thing that you also clarified, that most of these times the violence is not physical, so it is in the forms of emotional, psychological, and there are different types of violence that Reach Law also has promoted and talked about. So in the situations where the signs of these violence are not very explicit, like you don't see bruises or you don't see a particular shift in, say, productivity, or you don't see like explicit signs, how do you think as an organization or as individuals, how do we create an environment where we can detect signs early, at an early stage, so that not let the survivor suffer for decades in silence? Or like, how do we create that environment where even if we don't explicitly help them, but they feel it, that they're comfortable enough to talk to someone in the workplace?
Yeah. So, Tusharika, you are right. I think I want to clarify, and maybe I didn't say it correctly. I think it isn't limited to only physical violence. So, there could be physical violence and other forms of violence that are there. And it does become a little bit harder. But, like I said, many of the signs of abuse are not necessarily just regular bruises or scars. They aren't just that. There are other signs like absenteeism, presentism, anxiety, fear, confusion, drop in performance, being withdrawn, seeking isolation, not being open, not being transparent, being always in a state of confusion, extensively doubting yourself. So many of these signs, or also feeling very low, a certain level of depression, a certain level of feeling like life has no meaning, any of these. And these could be equally signs of distress for mental health issues or anything else as well. So anything that feels a little off, that is what I'd like to, I mean, all of these are indicative signs, but at the end of the day, you suddenly see a shift, you suddenly start feeling this person's not themselves. To reach out would be important. So I want to put that out there. Having said that, which is, the question that you specifically asked as to in some of these other forms, how does the organization become a lot more, sort of, a space that they provide, is essentially one, talking about it. So how much is the organization doing awareness sessions, sensitization, education around this topic altogether for employees, for managers, for leaders? Because one part of that sensitization also needs to be different forms of abuse. And therefore bringing it to the notice of employees to say it isn't essentially about physical violence that we're talking about here, but a whole lot of it, including sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, any other form of that. What is domestic violence by itself? That the pattern of abusive behaviors, the play of power, the fact that it's psychological. So to build that awareness, I think becomes important. The second part of it is similarly when you're making a policy, when you're drafting these helplines, when you're building a support system within the organization, to not qualify this only as physical violence, that I'll give leave only for this, but to say that, if there is leave that needs to be provided, safety leave, or anything, it is for other forms. And we recognize abuse as a holistic conversation, as a holistic piece, and not just look at it from one angle. I think that becomes sort of a very important thing to do, right? And when the organization, and that's what I mean, the organization sets the foundation for it in terms of saying these are the different forms, we recognize all of them are a possibility, it isn't just one. That is when individuals will also wake up and say, okay, now if I'm going through this also, I can speak about it. Right? If I'm going through this also, I can speak about it. It doesn't necessarily need to be physical in nature. And therefore, conversations around even understanding what emotional abuse constitutes, what is isolation, what is financial control, right, becomes sort of important. Somewhere I hope I answered. And I think again that I do want to say in all forms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the recognition that not everything is visible. Whether it is disability, whether it is sexual identity, orientation, gender, whether it is this, whether it is mental health, not everything is visible. And how do you make space, therefore, in your communication for the less visible, the invisible, is a starter, because that is even more difficult. What I can see, I can correct. What I cannot see, that becomes even more difficult for me to help, right?
So I definitely agree that, these sensitization workshops and even these sessions that you talked about, they're very underrated actually. They're organizations take it as like a burden on themselves, or sometimes that it's an added task. But for the people who are actually suffering, or for the people who know someone who is suffering, for those people, I think these small things go a long way into helping them, or giving them, a ray of hope that the organization is not ignorant to my problems, at least.
Yeah.
And that I think matters a lot in this topic that we're discussing today. So before I go on and ask a question which one of the audience members has put in my personal chat box, I'd like to remind everyone who's in the session as well as our live audience to follow our Instagram and Facebook and YouTube channel of @ReachLawyer. And also, if you have any queries or any legal assistance doubts, or if you are a survivor, or if you know someone who is suffering in silence, please do reach out to this email that's on my screen above, askreachlawyer@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to assist you. So I'll go on to the question that one of the audience members has asked me. So there are several instances where individuals who are suffering from domestic violence or mental health issues are considered to be a burden on the organization. Often they are discriminated against or bullied due to low productivity and inefficiency. What can be done on an individual level to deal with such a situation?
Yeah. So I think, I want to respond to this and say that more than at the individual level, it needs to be at the institutional level. Right. So this is something I would say is very clearly at the institutional level. So for example, do you have very clear anti-bullying policies, non-discrimination policies, equal opportunity policies? And when I mean a policy, I also mean a policy which is also giving very clear examples of what does one mean by some of these terms and things. What is bullying? What is discrimination? What are examples of them? How does it work? So that, I think, needs to be done in addition to putting a policy together, right? That education is important. So that, for example, is one piece. The second piece is that if you're saying zero tolerance, if you're saying zero tolerance for discrimination, for any form of bullying that happens, then how is the person who is bullying, how is the person who's doing this, how are they being penalized, right? And what is the grievance mechanism? Because often my experience is that we have a policy on paper, and the support systems to make that policy a reality are absent. So other than, for example, in prevention of sexual harassment, you have an IC, and then the members are trained, and they, even there is a lot of stigma. It's difficult. All that is one conversation, but at least that's there. So you need to have a very robust mechanism to be able to address some of this, and that becomes, a precedence that you said that if there is bullying, this is what is going to happen. The third piece and the very important part of this whole thing is after that, how do you sort of ensure there is performance protection? So, for example, can you in your policy as an organization say that if there is somebody who's going through domestic violence and is going through that, and the organization comes to know and is supporting them for that period of time, there will be performance protection, which means a certain rating will be there, or a certain kind of compensation protection for that cycle. And there are one or two organizations that have done it. So ensuring that at that point in time, I think, becomes important. The same goes for, mental health in a different way. And again, not to sort of see the problem becomes we start seeing these individuals as incompetent altogether, which is not true. With mental health in specific, I'd say, there is a perception, or there is a feeling that somebody going through this, anxiety, depression, will not be able to perform. That isn't necessarily true. What needs to happen is there needs to be workplace accommodations. There needs to be ways. So asking them, what support would you need? How would you need to manage your work? How would you like to work through this? With removing the stigma is something every individual, every manager can do. But you can do all of that only if you believe that there is nothing wrong with this individual. They are going through something, and we need to be there, and we need to be able to support them through this, right? So that the organization needs to mandate that needs to be the attitude, that needs to be the way that we work through this. And in both these spaces, I do want to say, with the pandemic, changes and conversations around this have happened. Even something like grief, for example, because during the second wave in specific, the number of people who lost family members and, people they knew and all of that in workplaces otherwise also was huge. Right. And therefore, conversations around grief. How does a manager support an employee through bereavement and grief beyond just giving that, that leave? All these things become sort of important. The last part of it is something that organizations, specifically because the question sort of went on to mental health. How are you impacting the mental health of the employee? How is work organized? How is work done in the organization? Are you looking at the structure? Are you sort of, is somebody feeling very overburdened? Is there only calls through the day? So some of those I think are also questions to dwell on and look at, because not all of this is only, mental health is not just about life outside the workplace. The workplace has a significant impact on mental health as well. So those would be like the different points that I would like to mention.
Yeah, we've all gone through the burden of online world in during the pandemic, and we do realize how mental health can be severely affected, not just at a workplace level, but even at college level when things are online. And we all
Yeah.
understand how those two concepts interplay.
Yeah, no, and there, Tusharika, I do want to qualify. For me, a workplace is any place where there are people coming together to do any form of common goal and an aim towards it, right? So for me, I would say that diversity dialogues is a workplace, Reach Lawyer is a workplace. It
Yeah.
isn't essentially, we often think it's some large corporate sitting out there. It isn't that. Every NGO is a workplace, every educational institution is a workplace. Right? Because there is also that system that is there, which holds the educational institution together, which holds the NGO together. And there are people who are working there. So it is very much a workplace. So this is common across the board, the online fatigue and some of these
Definitely.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have another question from the audience. So, do you think that access for domestic violence support or redressal mechanisms for disabled women is more limited? And how can we solve that issue?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is limited. It is limited because I'm not sure all the helplines, all the spaces, for example, are completely accessible. Also with persons with disability. I'm myself a person with disability, so I want to bring that angle in. I have something called left hemiplegia by birth. So none of you can see it, but I have paralysis on the left hand side of my body, right? So this is a space that I understand in terms of my own lived reality, of being a person with disability. So a lot of spaces are inaccessible. A lot of things are inaccessible today. And also with persons with disability, the level of dependence in some sense, and I want to be very, very realistic about it, not idealistic about it, is there. Right. So if I'm on a wheelchair and I have an intimate partner and that individual beats me up, for me to be able to get immediate support becomes very difficult. If I'm deaf, for example, where do I go and how does, because everything is a helpline, everything, how does that work? Right. So I think the most basic solution, and I'm glad somebody thought of this, brought this up, is how do each of these helplines, organizations, institutions make themselves accessible for persons with disability, right? Which could mean, for example, in addition to a helpline, you also have an online system where one can go in and report. You also have provision, these institutions are equipped with having a sign language interpreter in place. And there is that mandate also that very much sort of comes up. Today, I'm not sure where is that. I'm not sure there is that. And some of us have made our attempts, supported people we know who are women with disabilities, but all of it has happened, more on an offline, individual kind of a basis. I'm glad you brought this up. I think there's a lot more to be done. So that's one basic solution, which is to ensure accessibility to the extent possible, to recognize that there are women with disability who may be going through this, and therefore in your entire if you're NGO sort of enabling this, supporting this, to make sure you're asking those questions, saying, do you have a disability? Is there any other form of support you will need? I think those kind of things sort of become quite important. From a corporate and from an organization perspective, I'm not sure if there's anything drastically that needs to be done differently other than accessibility as well. And similarly, to keep this in mind as well. So that intersectional identity is very important. Thank you for bringing this up. I know it's not the most perfect, complete answer. I've made an attempt, but it has got me thinking. So thank you for asking the question.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering in such a detail. So we know that we have a law for sexual harassment at the workplace, which is the POSH Act, and it sets out, the redressal mechanisms, and it institutionalizes the organs which can help in such a situation when a woman is going through violence at the workplace. And the workplace definition has been given very wide in the Act. It includes interns, and it includes those temporary employees as well. So we have that act, but domestic violence as an issue is completely different, because it deals with things that are happening in your home behind closed doors, which you also probably wouldn't would be in denial of, or you wouldn't realize what is happening. So do you think, in your experience, we need a law in place, like sexual harassment law, which will help organizations build another redressal mechanism which can help them to prevent domestic violence and help those survivors in the workplace? Do you
Right.
think that will be feasible also?
I certainly, so, I mean, I don't come in with my own recommendation is slightly going to be for every organization to have a policy in place for sure. And if the law of the land can mandate that policy to exist, that would be useful, because every organization is different. The mechanisms, the business, where are they operating from, what are the support systems would be different. But to say that there is need for a workplace to recognize this, to support, to sort of support the survivors of domestic violence, that could be something that legally can be mandated. Because today, for example, there are laws, and there is the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, but again, because it is domestic violence, the act sort of doesn't get into the workplace so much, but it talks a lot more about domestic violence at home, and how can the reporting happen, how can the police, what, all those kind of things. Even having a crime against women cell in in the police station, those kind of things is what the law really essentially does today. What I would say is, whether the law frames a prevention of sexual because the prevention of sexual harassment talks about sexual harassment at the workplace. So it is about that. And therefore it becomes sort of more mandated for the workplace. But I think what might be helpful is for the law to actually say that every organization needs to have a policy, needs to support. It is not a choice whether I believe I can, I cannot, I don't wish to, I don't want to, but the workplace says, yes, if there is, I need to support in whichever ways I can. That would be useful. So similar to what the Rights to Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016 does in some way in the space of disability, where it says reasonable accommodation, equal opportunity. It mandates some of these things for employers to do. I think something similar to that would be quite helpful. The mechanics of it is every organization specific. I don't think there can be a law that can clearly qualify that, because this isn't, in that sense, it isn't abuse happening at the workplace. It's abuse happening somewhere else, which is having a ramification, and the workplace as a participant in the society needs to take a cognizance of it, needs to put their foot into it.
Thank you, ma'am. So I have one last question, and after that we'll move to our open discussion segment. So my last question is that you talked about a lot of these workshops, and these counseling sessions, as well as these sensitization workshops. So we do have the organizations in India. Some of the organizations in India, they do have some kind of mental health support, or counseling service,
Yeah.
or HR, which is there at a basic level to deal with such instances. However, we still see that women are still not opening up, and the work that is done till now is not enough. So, what do you think can be done better in that regard with those existing establishment and institutions that are in place to make things better for survivors? Or are there some examples in your experience, and some instances where they have gone the extra mile and it has actually proven to be effective for women?
Right. So, Tusharika, I think the HR person in the organization or the HR system in the organization, or even having mental health support isn't enough, because, again, mental health support is more, more to manage overall mental health and wellness, and doesn't necessarily only dwell on domestic violence and domestic abuse and the survivors. Certainly, what needs to be done though is to check if this particular institution that one is partnering with, it's called the Employee Assistance Program in many organizations, to check if they are enabled enough to support. If somebody comes in and talks to them saying, I'm going through this, where do you direct? How do you direct? How do you have that conversation? How do you hold space? Do you break confidentiality? What do you do to have that sort of established? I think becomes very important. But I'd not rest it only on these two groups, right? For the HR organization, I would think, and that is why I'm saying that it needs to be taken as a part of either diversity, equity, inclusion, or in any other format, and it needs to be handled separately. So, for example, to develop a set of, responders, right, peer supporters, to develop that, to train them, to have managers equipped to do that job as well, to have leaders equipped to do that job, to have a set of resources, to have a policy in place, which says that these are the different things an organization and institution can offer. All that becomes a part of the whole picture. It cannot get limited to these two groups doing anything. Right, and mandating and talking about things like it will not affect performance, because let's recognize, if I'm going through this in my personal space, right, why will I talk about it in the organization if I believe the organization is not going to do anything about it, right? Why will I put my job at stake? Unless and until I believe that the organization, if I can go and tell my manager, the manager A will take cognizance of it, will say, okay, let me give you, do you need this period time off? Do you need to relocate? And can we make anything happen for you? Do you need any other form of support? How are you thinking of safety planning? Is there anything else that can be done? If the organization and the individual, which is the manager or the team member or even the responder, isn't equipped, why will I go and inform? And if there isn't performance protection at the end of the day, or job security at the end of the day, that is assured somewhere, saying that if you come and report this, the next thing, which is the question somebody asked, is not going to be bullying. The next thing is not going to be telling you it's a fault of yours. And the next thing is not going to be penalizing you for performance. Why will I risk it? So that's why most people don't report it, because we don't have that system today. And to build that system is sort of the need of the hour. Where this is recognized, this is organizations are aware this is happening, where organizations are aware that this is important and they need to put their foot into it in this manner. And I'm not saying you need to walk into the person's house and have a fight um, with the perpetrator. That is not the point. But to recognize some of these things and to put that out there becomes important. Then it gives me safety. It says, okay, now if I'm going through this, I can tell my manager. The manager is required to behave in this way. There is no bullying that the manager can do. There is no effect on performance. This is the form of support I will get. And there are organizations, few and far in between, that have done this. In the last about 2 years. Before that, I'm not aware, but in the last about 2 years, they have. So, and they have had cases being reported. They've had all that. So, so to build that ecosystem and that focus on this subject, like there is focus on some of the others, is what is needed, really. So I hope that answers.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all my questions and the audience's questions with such patience and depth. So with this, we come to the end of the Q&A session. And now I call upon Mr. B.T. Venkatesh, sir, who is the founder of ReachLawyer Sóz, as well as the founder of the organization ReachLawyer, to talk about his insights on today's topic.
I have questions. When we get someone with such amount of expertise, it's always a great joy to learn more, because we have many challenges which we keep facing. Taking from what you left in the earlier question, see, we also provide assistance, advice to good number of workers, not only from the organized sector, but also from unorganized sector. More particularly, people who are working in industries like supply chain industries, like garments industries. We come across domestic violence is one of the menace which we have. It's all prevalent all over. We keep getting these kind of complaints from the unions and places. So we come across instances of domestic violence, and the women unwilling to report it. One part. The supply chain institutions which are there, they do have some policies. The question of complaints in all these things becomes a serious issue. In fact, one of the major challenge we see is the compliance. The constrict of compliance is always there. In fact, we say that we have systems in place, but the systems are actually not in place. There is no confidence which is for the victim to come and report. And great number of instances, the complaints which are done, some of these instances result in termination in employment or ensuring the kind of thing. The courts, the institution starts looking at the productivity. One of the major challenges that the supply chain industry has is the kind of meeting the targets are concerned. So the procuring organization has its targets set, and the institution which provides that in supply chain finds it challenging to comply and also provide this kind of meeting the target. I think how exactly are these to understand what exactly should be the way forward on this? It's something which is very, very essential at this point of time, because in Bangalore we have close to 1 million government workers at Bangalore and around. So that demonstrates the volume of women who are working. Majority of them are being women in this. One area which is of serious concern, sure.
Right. It's a tough question. And I will be very open, and I will say that I don't have like a very ready answer on this to give. And perhaps what comes to me now is also the point that Tusharika made at some level on how do you bring in more compliance on the whole piece. I think that sort of comes in for me. But to recognize, I think that productivity and that entire piece, how do you manage that in general, is a conversation I think that needs to be had, because there is mental health, there is domestic violence, there are many other things that are happening. So how do you plan for that? How do you, I mean, if nothing else, there is maternity, there is so many different angles and aspects that come in, and life stages and these significant things that happen to each one of us, it happens to each one of us, right? So how do you plan for that in your workforce planning by itself is the question that I would actually raise. I'm not sure in organizations today that gets done. And I don't come from an unorganized sector. My experience, my work is been with the organized sector. And I find that it is missing to some extent even there. This planning of, what if there is an exigency? What if there is a certain thing? How do we plan for that backup? How do we make sure that that is going to happen? How do we organize shifts in a way that that piece is managed? I think is something that needs to happen better. But again, like I said, it's a thought-provoking question, not something that, I have ready answers to. I'd love to hear your thoughts, sir. if there is anything that you found particularly helping.
Thank you very much. It has been such a pleasure. I think one of our team members, Gargi, has a question. I think let her question come. Thereafter, I'll complete with my view. Gargi, over to you.
So Tusharika has already asked my question actually. I have said,
At this point, I'll just like to remind the audience also, in case anyone has any questions to ask ma'am, you can put in the chat box, or you can turn your camera on and unmute, and ma'am will answer your question. So you can go ahead now.
It's such a joy. In fact, the very construct of ReachLawyer Sóz was ReachLawyer is a community of lawyers, activists, students, academics, journalists, and concerned. So we have a large community of all these people, and because today we felt that there is a need for more dialogues, and I am with one who is running a huge program on dialogues. This is something which is much essential. I think it's a joy to have you today in the program. It makes great sense. One aspect which I always feel is that the construct of a listener, but we have been talking about it all the days. The entire SOOTHE program, which we have been trying to put forward on the issues of women's rights are concerned, it's larger. It's predominantly workplace, at home, in society, the kind of challenges that she faces, whether it's glass ceiling, whether it's sticky floor, any of these issues which she is facing. We try to look at these subjects under the ReachLawyer Sóz program. One of the specific initiative that we have initiated in SOOTHE, especially SOOTHE is the Initiative for Women's Rights, is now on the issue of domestic violence and its impact. It has, the dimensions are huge, the kind of aspects which we talk in terms, in fact, last 5 days have been an amazing journey in these dialogues are concerned. We intend to continue with this. In fact, today your presentation actually opens up so many more questions, so many more dimensions, so many more aspects. In fact, from within the frame of a workplace, what exactly are the challenges? That's something I felt is very essential that we need to go about. The very reason which we find is that because we have been practicing lawyers for many years and decades of our experience, many women who come to us come with a statement. We see that she had been in domestic violence, suffering domestic violence, a victim for 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. In one case, the woman was victim of domestic violence for 58 years. It's unimaginable the kind of pain they go through. Many of them, they ask questions that, why did you wait this long? Why did you take it? Then the responses are very, very interesting. Some are vocal, some are very silent, some are, in fact, the impact of domestic violence such that they are disoriented. Many of them who really talk something, they make a statement that every time I wanted to take a call, the parent said, somehow you have to survive this marriage. They're surviving a marriage. To keep the marriage going, the friends advise that, the relatives advise that, and you have children. So what will happen to your children? Children need a father. So the kind of the various aspects that come into, the person continues to be in domestic violence. Then we ask that, they said one more aspect which is very crucial was that they don't find one who is empathetic listener. They don't find one who would give them a proper advice what should be the way. They don't find, in fact, a number of cases that we have found where women have taken the decision and taken into action. Many a time it so happens the advocates they engage, they will not be able to address the kind of concerns that they have because they come from very strictly a legal framework. The ability of the person to communicate in a particular language in domestic violence is difficult. As such, communicating is difficult to a person. So we come across this for many women. One of the client which we had, she told me that it's very difficult for a woman because she would not be sharing the kind of issues with her friend. She would not be sharing with the kind of problems that she faces with the family. And it becomes extremely difficult for a woman to share it with an absolute stranger like a lawyer, whom she's seeking an advice. Many a time, one of the most crucial information that would be very beneficial to her interest in the litigation would not be communicated to her because she feels that it may be inconsequential, maybe it is not an important one. So these are the kind of challenges we see. So there is a requirement which we felt at ReachLawyer that we need to develop a system, a space for women to find someone who is a listener. We have to create a community of listeners, a community of counselors. For example, someone like you, we do provide some amount of counseling, but what happens, counseling is itself a very important area and requires great amount of skills and training. Yes. It's not something which people keep thinking that anybody can counsel. It's not easy to counsel. It's a very serious profession that's available, and there are very, very few professionals that we have. In fact, when you look at the kind of the city like Bangalore, such a city, which degree of literacy and all that, we find it extremely difficult to find counselors to address these kind of issues. So given that kind of thing, there is a need for identifying good counselors, there's a need for creating a body of counselors, and there's a need for dialogues of this nature. So I think that's one of the major areas I feel is that these dialogues need to be taken to the industry, to the open spaces. So it's necessary that all of them these need to be done so that people can create these kind of spaces. In fact, when you're talking in terms of an organized sector, creating some space which is available so that she can share without there being a challenge, a fear or impact. That's something which is needed. I think I would like you to throw some light on that will be helpful. This is something looking at,
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think there needs to be more and more spaces of that nature and kind. There are some, but there needs to be a lot more of it. And for all of us to recognize, right, that if somebody walks into us and reports, going through domestic violence, what you so rightly said, I mean, the first part of it, which is not to negate the whole experience, right? And not to sort of say that, why didn't you come before, or what made you stay quiet for so long? Because that's the whole point. It is a dilemma for anybody going through it, and the societal structure that we live in, specifically when there is intimate partner violence and in a marriage construct, leaving it is very difficult. So, we live in that space. So to understand that if somebody is not reported so far, there are many reasons why that could be happening. And to be able to say, okay, thank God you came right now to talk about it, I think that becomes important. The second is to respect confidentiality. Right. And to be able to, I'm sort of just saying, what can each of us do if somebody walks in? And to respect that becomes important. The third part of it is to acknowledge the injustice. Because many a times with domestic violence, it's just a slap. It happens in relationships. You can go back, you are not trying hard enough to make it happen. And it's likely that a survivor has heard that time and again from their family members to start with. So this becomes sort of important. The other part is to help the individual plan their safety. So, for example, in many cases, the individual may not be willing to leave the relationship or change things. And then how can you help them plan their safety? And to respect the individual's autonomy in decision making, because frankly, that part of it is where the boundary comes in of saying, this isn't my life. So just because I'm supporting an individual, I cannot say, oh, leave the relationship, right? And listening and empathetic listening, all that is something each one of us can try our best to do. In addition to, of course, having counseling support, having services in place, having institutions that can provide that. Because my recognition is, while there can be a lot more. And again, these institutions need to be intersectional. To recognize that there could be women with disability who could be coming in. There could be women who are queer who could be coming in. There could be people from the LGBTQ community who essentially don't identify as women who may be coming in. And that is the other piece. I think we are very clearly looking at it. I mean, the tendency even for these institutions to look at it in a very, this is the woman we are talking about. This is the kind of violence that becomes problematic. So I think some of that needs to happen. In addition to training, like you said, I mean, I'm glad, an institution like yours is doing that, which is to train even lawyers on how to hold space, how to listen, because some bit of it doesn't only happen with a counselor. It will happen everywhere the person goes to, right? And I think that those are some of the thoughts that are coming up for me.
Yeah, one aspect which you wanted to, why we started this kind of thing was at ReachLawyer, we were engaging for some training program for talking about this issue of domestic violence to the garment workers. So it was a very interesting experience I would like to share.
Yes.
When we did the program for them, informing them what are the kinds of laws available or what are the rights that you have, there was literally not much of a response from the workers. And then after some days, one of the worker who is also an office bearer of the union, which was our NGO, which was working with them, she came to us and said that what they want is that someone need to have, they would like to have a dialogue with you. So that was the thing which she said. I said, fine, we'll have a dialogue. Then we informed them. Then we had to sit work and we informed them that we are not going to be judgmental. First, then we also informed them that we are willing to listen. And then we said that we are going to inform you what are the possible options that a person has. And a very interesting part was we had given more space for these workers to speak up. Some of them who came to start with was that when they explained every aspect of the domestic violence that they had, and then we did not make any, we ensured that the communication goes to them that we are not going to be judgmental, we'll just listen to them. And then we said that these are all the options that they have and the consequences of these options which she can exercise. Many women, they said that they would not like to leave the marriage, but they said very important to us that, so the discussion that we had today is going to be useful for me because I can negotiate in my marriage. I can negotiate in my marriage and start telling that people that these are the options that I have. And if these things happen, I will take an action of this nature. So the constructs which we developed, we found that there is a need that in great number of cases to listen without being judgmental about what exactly happens, giving them that space to explain, giving that space to unburden themselves. I think that kind of spaces which are needed. And of course, as you said, there is a need for building a very strong confidentiality in respect of these kind of discussions and concern, this process is concerned. I think we would like to see more on that particular process, how that needs to be done, what are the ways that can be developed. At ReachLawyer, we have been doing this activity. So therefore, we have opened up this SOOTHE program where anyone who is in such situation can just mail us. We have an advantage that we have a work with large workforce which is quite articulate. So we ask them to write. In fact, we have been making this experiment earlier too in the litigation that we handle, where we ask women who come in distress to sit and first write what exactly they have. So when they sit and start writing, some of them come with a half a page note. Some of them say that, I said, nothing more. We try to talk to them, say that, how much, what exactly has happened. So then we start getting them opening up as we engage with them on second or third session. They open up and they explain the things. This is something which is the case. We also have good amount of experience because we have been working on LGBTQ communities for more than 2.5 decades as of now, and excellent amount because we have done great amount of work for the communities all these years. One of the things which never get reported is the kind of intimate partner violence that the communities go through. In fact, it has been extremely violent, and virtually there is no law for them to protect. The fear factor, the kind of stigma that's attached, I think it has been a Herculean task for us to help them out. We have been successful in some of the proceedings that we have done,
Right.
but it's a Herculean task. There's absolutely, it's still a gray area which we have been working on. There is a need, therefore, that creates more and more spaces and more dialogue with the institutions and also industry. That's something which is, I feel, is the need of the hour, because unless we come across a space, so when we talk that workplace is a safe place for a woman in domestic violence, that how safe it can be, how better it can be made, I think is one of the major challenges that we see. I think it's still an area which is to be done, great amount of work that needs to be done. I think we'll continue with this particular thing. We again announce to audience that in any case of challenges that you have, you can just mail us at askreachlawyer@gmail.com. We are here to listen to you. We are here to note. We are here to see which is the best possible advice or the options that we can explain it to you, because I feel there's a need for that. Reach Lawyer is not just one, or this is a community of lawyers. Across India we have, and across Karnataka we have, and amazing lawyers with great amount of expertise. They come to us, they give us the opinion, and therefore it's a place where you can assuredly present something and seek what are the options that you have. Always remember, askreachlawyer@gmail.com is a very simple address to write to. So coming to Madhumita, I keep talking about it because there's a need for talking about these kind of things and options which are available. And this was a very invigorating discussion that we had today. We have opened up so much more to discuss. In fact, with this conversation that we had today, I think we have learned that, you come with a huge body of work that need to be done, and a huge area of discussion that need to be conducted on these issues. We'll be again troubling you again and again on this subject, because it's very essential to the people who are in need, because many of them who are out there, many of them who have very scared of voicing their issues, will get to know that there are spaces, will get to know that there are people who are willing to listen without being judgmental. I think that's something which is a communication that we need to do. I think that's something which is the challenge which is continuing to happen, but we need to create that kind of more and more spaces. So I will request Tusharika to continue.
I do want to say something,
Please,
so I
please.
and a minute to Sharika before I give
Please,
it.
no, you can take your time. These are something, every word of it is so important and essential at ReachLawyer Sóz. This is going to be an absolutely important discussion, so that we can learn more on this and how to improve our work too. Yes, please do.
Absolutely. So I just sort of, I think everything, and I'm fascinated by what ReachLawyer is doing and the amount of work it's already done and is looking to do. I just say that if you are somebody who's listening and who is in that role of providing support to a domestic violence survivor, it is important that you take care of yourself as well. And I'm mentioning that because many a times we tend to sort of deprioritize that and say, oh, we'll help and we'll support and all of that. But to take care of your own mental health, your own well-being in the process is important. So I wanted to just put that out there, because that was something that that struck me. The other part that I would also add in and say is that when you do awareness or sessions, likelihood of people coming up after that reporting into you will be higher. immediately, especially after a session. We've had that a lot at diversity dialogues. And how do you then manage that? How do you know how to address that? Becomes very important. And given these 2 points, I'd say if you are not somebody, who's aware, then to reach out to ReachLawyer, to reach out to, say, diversity dialogues, to reach out to people who are working in the space in whichever capacity, would be something that one may wish to do instead of taking the burden on yourself completely. So those are the different kinds of things that I would, bring in. I would say that at diversity dialogues, at team at diversitydialogues.in, please feel free to write in. If you're an institution and you want to work and see how you can, as a workplace, offer greater support for individuals, for employees, for associates, for anybody, for suppliers, for others who may be going through domestic violence or domestic abuse. I see a question here. So if the abuser is working in the same organization that the survivor has just joined for work, then if the survivor talks to the employer about domestic violence, is it possible that she's not believed? It is possible. Sure. It is very much possible. And it's a very important and a good question that has come up. Yes. And I would say that irrespective or whether the survivor and the abuser are in the same organization or in different organizations, when a survivor comes up to you and tells you, I'm going through domestic violence and I'm going through this kind of difficulty, this is the problem, I'm wondering what to do, I am very worried about, should I take next step, should I not? Please validate the experience. Please believe the person for what they are saying. Please do not question it. Even if you happen to know who the abuser is, and that individual seems like somebody who could never abuse anybody, right? Sometimes, that feeling that, oh, this individual cannot do it can come into our head. And that is what, Venkatesh sir spoke about when he said that listen without judgment. Because when you're listening without judgment, you are not coloring your own judgment of saying, oh, this person looks like, she's working in a large corporate, she has financials, she cannot be abused. Or saying that this individual is reporting against this other individual, that person cannot be, because I think that they are not somebody who can possibly be an abuser. To hold your judgment on the whole piece aside and listen to it and give the person choices and options and what can they do, what are the different acts available, what is the protection they have, who are the different organizations in the space, who can they reach out, how can the workplace help. Those are the things that you do, right? So it's possible that she's not believed, but it's important that we believe her. It's important. It's absolutely the start point of saying it's important that you believe her. Even if you don't have all the answers, please believe. Don't hold your own judgment of who you think the abuser is and why they cannot be the abuser, and so on and so forth. So I hope that sort of answers. Over to you, Tusharika. I've said
one word to say in this is that at ReachLawyer, the very whole process of this particular dialogues was needed more, because we have had clients who come to us who are very well placed in the industry. Someone being a vice president of a company, somebody being a senior general manager in a company, to a person who is a government worker. So all of them come with the kind of domestic violence that they have faced serious challenges. It does not mean that one who is at helm of the affairs in an institution is not facing a challenge. In fact, we had instances where one of the senior vice, she was vice president of a company, and she was financially drained. She was exploited to such a degree that she was so much burdened, she could not get out of the marriage, despite the fact that she had the confidence to take things on. She could not do it because the way she was entangled in all those kind of property issues and financial drain on her person, she was unwilling to go about it. She continued to be in such a relationship despite the fact that she was being put to such amount of difficulty at home. And so therefore, we come across this as the entire spectrum of persons. So whether it is one who is at the lower end of the income scale or the higher end of the income scale, whether one is gender divergent or one who is otherwise, all of them, this is something which is a challenge that keeps seeing in this profession. The whole purpose of this ReachLawyer Sóz was initiated because of the experiences that we had.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that point. Economic class, and we think it is going to be more in certain strata of the society, lesser in other strata, and all of that. I don't think that that is true at all, even in my experience. So thank you, sir, for pointing that out. Yeah. Tusharika, over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much, sir, for bringing about today's discussion. It was an absolute honor for me to moderate this session and be among someone from such a demeanor and background as you. And today's intersectional discussion really opened my eyes personally, and I'm sure all the live audience members and the people who are present in this session have been positively affected by today's discussion. And with this, we come to the end of the 6th day of Untangled Setting Her Free series. The 6 days have been great, and we have 2 more days to go to International Women's Day and 2 more days of Untangled Setting Her Free series. So we hope that we continue to learn more and more from each other, and we continue to have these debates, dialogues, and discussions about pertinent issues such as today's topic. And thank you so much, ma'am, for coming to our session today. And thank you to all the audience members who joined and asked their questions. Your questions really added a lot of weight to today's discussion. So thank you, everyone. And with this, I'll request everyone to turn on their cameras so that we can take like a picture.
Yeah, done.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much to everyone.
Yeah.